There is a kind of silence that belongs only to high places. Not the silence of an empty room or a held breath, but something older and more deliberate. The silence of stone that has endured centuries of wind and still chosen to say nothing. Sable Wren had climbed enough mountains in her life to know the difference between a place that was simply quiet and a place that was keeping a secret. The Gray Mountain was keeping several. She had known it since she was a child, pressing her small palms against the rock face at its base, while the other pups raced each other across the valley below, feeling something hum beneath the stone like a second heartbeat, buried very deep. The adults had pulled her away without explanation. The elders had changed the subject. And the mountain had gone on keeping its silence, patient and enormous and absolutely certain that the right person would eventually come back to listen. Sable was 24 years old, and she was fairly certain she was not the right person for anything in particular. That was not self-pity. It was a precise and honest assessment she had arrived at after years of careful observation, the same way she assessed wind direction and soil saturation, and the subtle language of bent grass that told her which way a prey animal had moved and how long ago. She was good at reading things. She was not good at being read. The clan of Ashvale had approximately 340 wolves distributed across 4 territorial sectors, and of those 340, perhaps a dozen, could have told you Sable Wren's name without being prompted. Her father had been a beta of some standing once, before a political miscalculation during the last Alpha succession had stripped him of rank and reputation in the same afternoon. He had died 4 years ago, quietly, in the way that disgraced wolves often died, not from violence, but from the slow erosion of being made to feel that their continued existence was a mild inconvenience to people with more important concerns. Sable had inherited his skill with terrain, and his talent for making herself small in rooms where she didn't belong. She had also inherited his position as a territory tracker, which was considered one of the least glamorous functions in the clan hierarchy, and therefore left almost entirely to her own direction. No one supervised her routes. No one questioned her reports. No one read them particularly carefully either, which had been a source of quiet frustration for the past 8 months, because for 8 months, Sable had been writing in precise and increasingly urgent language about the thing that was happening to the territory, and for 8 months the council had been filing her reports in whatever mental drawer they reserved for information that complicated their preferred version of events. The rivers were dying. That was the plain fact of it, stripped of diplomatic softening, not receding seasonally the way rivers did in dry years, not running lower than usual because of reduced snowmelt, but dying in a way that had a quality of intention to it, a directional wrongness that moved from the high ground downward as though something at the source was drinking the water before it could flow. The Crestfall tributary, which had fed the eastern grazing lands for as long as anyone in Ashvale had records, had been reduced to a line of damp mud by midsummer. The Ven River, wider and older, and considered essentially permanent by every wolf who had ever stood on its banks, was half its usual depth and falling. The hunting grounds that depended on those waterways had gone sparse and then silent, the prey animals moving elsewhere or simply disappearing, and the soil in the affected zones had developed a particular gray quality that Sable had never seen before and could not find a name for in any of the territorial records she had access to. She had written all of this down. She had included sketches of the affected soil, samples wrapped in cloth and left on the council table with detailed notes about where they had been collected. She had cross-referenced the pattern of the dying against historical records of drought and found that the pattern did not match. Historical droughts moved with weather systems, following the logic of rainfall and temperature. This moved like a radius expanding outward from a single point, and that point, according to every line of data Sable had gathered, was somewhere near the summit of the Gray Mountain. The council had thanked her for her thoroughness and explained that natural cycles were complex and that the clan's senior analysts were monitoring the situation. The senior analysts, as far as Sable could determine, had not left the central compound in several weeks. So she had packed 3 days of supplies, told no one where she was going, because no one would have asked, and started climbing. That had been yesterday morning. She was most of the Way up now, moving through the band of ancient pines that grew at this elevation in twisted, wind-carved shapes, their roots gripping the rock face with the desperate determination of things that had decided to survive somewhere they had no business surviving. Sable understood that impulse completely. The air up here was different, thinner and sharper, carrying a metallic edge that she had been tasting since she crossed the tree line, and that was getting stronger with altitude. Not iron, not copper. Something she didn't have a word for. A mineral resonance that pressed against the inside of her nose and made her wolf stir uneasily in the back of her chest. She stopped on a shelf of flat rock and looked out over the territory. From here she could see the full spread of Ashvale lands, the valley floor and the river systems, and the patchwork of forest and open ground that constituted everything her clan called home. She could see, with terrible clarity from this height, the pattern she had been tracking at ground level. From above it was unmistakable. The gray discoloration in the soil, the thinning of the tree canopy, the dull absence of water where water should be gleaming in the afternoon light. It spread outward from directly above her in a perfect, expanding ring, and it was not a natural pattern. Natural things did not make perfect rings. Natural things were irregular and variable and responsive to 100 different local conditions. This was something else. This was a wound, and something was pulling at its edges, making it wider. She ate a handful of dried meat and drank from her water skin, and looked up at the remaining climb, with the focused calm she brought to every difficult piece of terrain. Then she kept going. The storm stone was not what she had expected. She had found references to it in 3 separate places in the clan archives. Always oblique, always surrounded by the particular kind of vagueness that indicated something people had agreed not to discuss directly. A sealed place on the mountain, a stone of binding, something put there by the founders for the protection of the clan. The descriptions stopped consistently short of explaining what the stone looked like or what it contained, or why looking at it directly was apparently inadvisable. And Sable had noted this pattern of strategic omission with the same interest she brought to any gap in available information. The stone was roughly the size of a cart horse, and embedded in the rock face near the summit, as though it had always been part of the mountain, and not, as everything about its surface suggested, placed there by someone with considerable power and considerable reason. It was a deep charcoal gray, almost black, and its surface was not smooth but intricately marked with lines and symbols that Sable recognized after a moment as a very old form of the binding script used in the clan's ancestral rituals, though rendered here with a complexity and density that made the ceremonial version she had seen in documents look like rough drafts. The symbols were not carved into the stone. They appeared to be inside it, suspended in the rock the way insects were sometimes suspended in amber, visible and permanent, and sealed away from any possibility of change. At least, they should have been. Sable crouched in front of the stone and studied it the way she studied everything, with patience and without preconception, letting it tell her what it wanted to tell her, rather than looking for confirmation of what she already thought. The metallic resonance she had been tasting since the tree line was emanating from the stone directly now, strong enough that she could feel it as a vibration in her back teeth, and the gray wrongness she had been tracking across the territory for 8 months had its visible origin here. A crack, hairline thin and running vertically through the lower third of the stone face, and from that crack, the color was leaching out into the rock around it and downward into the mountain itself, spreading through the geology of the peak, the way dye spread through water, inevitable and unstoppable unless the source was addressed. Someone had damaged the seal. That was her immediate professional assessment. Not age, not natural weathering. The crack had a quality of force to it, originating from inside the stone and pressing outward, as though whatever was in there had found one weak point and was working it methodically over time. Given that the damage appeared to have been progressing for approximately 8 months, which aligned precisely with when she had first noticed the territorial changes, she concluded that the stone had been weakening for longer and had reached some threshold 8 months ago that allowed the effect to begin manifesting externally. She reached out and touched the crack without thinking about it, the same instinct that made her press her hand to injured ground to better understand what was wrong. With it, the stone was warm, which it should not have been at this altitude in the cooling afternoon air. It was also vibrating under her fingers with something that was almost a pulse, and the binding symbols around the crack were dimmer than the ones farther away. Their light, and she had not registered until this moment that they were faintly luminous, a cold blue-white glow she had mistaken for reflected sky, guttering the way a candle guttered when the wax was nearly gone. Then the crack widened under her hand by approximately the width of a finger, and the light in the symbols went out all at once, and the stone split from top to base with a sound like the sky being torn open. Sable was thrown backward by a force that was not quite wind, and not quite anything else she had a name for, a concussive pressure that knocked her off her feet and sent her sliding 3 meters down the rock face before she caught herself on an outcropping with both hands, heart hammering and ears ringing, and every wolf instinct she possessed screaming at her to run immediately. She did not run. She had learned a long time ago that running from things she didn't understand was how she ended up not understanding them, and she needed to understand this. She climbed back up to the summit ledge with her hands shaking slightly, and her wolf pressed flat against the inside of her chest in a posture she had never felt from herself before, something between submission and terror, and looked at what had been inside the stone. He was very tall. That was the first thing she registered, the sheer verticality of him, the way he occupied space as though height was not a physical fact, but a choice he had made and intended to maintain. He was on his knees on the rock face, one hand braced against the shattered stone, and even kneeling he reached a scale that made the space around him feel rearranged. His hair was dark and loose and moving in a wind that Sable could not feel on her own skin. His clothes were old, the kind of old that existed outside fashion because they predated the concept entirely. Dark fabric that seemed to absorb the fading light rather than reflect it, and his eyes, when he raised them to look at her, were the amber gold of a hawk's eyes at the exact moment it sights prey, ancient and precise, and carrying within them a quality that made the world feel briefly less solid. He looked at her for a very long time without speaking. She looked back at him with the particular focused stillness she brought to encounters with things she did not yet understand. "You are not an alpha," he said finally. His voice had the texture of wind through high stone, resonant and unhurried, carrying harmonics that did not quite resolve into anything the human ear expected sound to do. "No," Sable agreed. "You are not an elder. You are not a council member or a representative of the founding line." He was still looking at her with that hawk's precision, cataloging her the way she cataloged terrain. "You are a tracker." "Yes." "And you came here alone." "Yes." Something shifted in his expression that was not quite confusion, but was in the vicinity of it, as though he had prepared for a range of possible scenarios, and she was not among them. He looked down at his own hand against the shattered stone, then at the pieces of the binding all around him, then back at her. "Why?" he said, and it was not a question so much as the beginning of a very long inquiry. Sable looked at the shattered seal, at the crack she had touched, at the 8 months of territorial damage she had tracked to this exact point, and made the honest and not particularly flattering assessment that she had almost certainly made things significantly more complicated. "I was investigating an environmental anomaly," she said. He stared at her. "An environmental anomaly. The rivers have been failing. The soil is dying. I tracked the origin to this location." She paused. "I may have accelerated a process that was already in progress." He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that she could not classify as either humor or its absence, something that existed in the register between them. 300 years, he said, very quietly, and the words had a weight to them that she felt in her sternum. 300 years in the dark, and the one who ends it is a tracker investigating an environmental anomaly. "I'm sorry," Sable said. She meant it precisely and completely. "I didn't know what was in the stone." "No," he agreed. "You wouldn't." He looked out over the territory spread below them, and something moved through his face that she would not be able to name until much later, when she knew him better. It was the expression of someone looking at something they had loved for a very long time, from a very great distance. finally close enough to see how much had changed. They would not have told you. If you are watching this, and you have ever known what it is, to work in a place where your labor is used and your name is forgotten, then you already understand something about Sable Wren that takes most wolves in this story considerably longer to grasp. Stay with me. This is only the beginning. His name was Cale Dawnspire, and he told her this the same way he seemed to do everything in those first hours, with a directness that had no room in it for social performance, stripped of the layers of implication and positioning that characterized most. Communication Sable encountered in the clan. He had been called the Sky Falcon by the founders of Ashvale, a title given to him not by his own kind, but by the wolves who had first encountered him 3 centuries and some years ago, when the territory was new and the clan was still learning the shape of the land it had claimed. He was not a wolf. He was not human. He was something older than both categories, a primordial of the air, one of the entities that had existed in the spaces between settlements since before settlements existed, with a consciousness and a history, and a set of capabilities that the founding wolves had recognized immediately as useful. They had asked him for his help. He had given it freely, because the land was suffering under the weight of an infestation of corrupted magic that had spread from a collapsed ley line to the north, and he cared about the land in a way that was more fundamental than allegiance to any particular group of people living on it. He had fought alongside the founding pack for 3 seasons, helped them stabilize the territory, helped them rebuild the damaged ley line into something functional, helped them root out the corruption that had been killing the ground from below. He had done this without contract or condition because it had needed doing, and he was capable of doing it. And then, when the immediate crisis had passed, and the clan was no longer afraid and had begun the human process of assigning credit and establishing hierarchy and deciding who owned the story of what had happened, the founding council had looked at Cale Dawnspire and seen not an ally who had helped them, but a power they could not control, living in their territory without their permission, with capabilities that would always exceed their own. They had asked him to remain as a bound guardian, not a partner, but a possession, a weapon sealed to their service. He had declined. They had sealed him anyway. Using a binding, they had spent the 3 seasons of cooperation secretly preparing, worked into the stone of the mountain, because stone was patient and old, and did not easily release what it held. He told her all of this without visible anger, which she found more disturbing than anger would have been. Anger meant the wound was still fresh. This flatness meant it had scarred over a very long time ago, into something that had simply become part of the landscape of him. The binding was keyed to a specific condition, he said. They were sitting on the rock face now, some careful distance apart, the shattered stone between them. The light was going, and the mountain air had developed the serious cold of high elevation after sunset. And Sable had retrieved her pack, and was wearing her outer layer and watching him with the alert stillness she gave to everything she considered important. He did not appear to feel the cold. It would hold until the last living member of the founding bloodline either released it willingly or died. Without heirs, the founding line has apparently persisted, which is why I was still contained. The current Alpha traces the founding line, Sable said. Alpha Corvin. The lineage goes back to the original founding council. Then I should still be sealed. He looked at the shattered stone around them with an expression she was learning to read as thoughtful. Unless the condition was met in a way the binding did not anticipate. She thought about the crack, about the 8 months of slow pressure she had documented in the territorial data without understanding its source, about the way the binding symbols had been dimming, losing light gradually, not all at once. The founding condition may have had a vulnerability, she said carefully. If the heir has done something that technically constitutes a breach of the original agreement that created the seal, the binding's own terms might have begun to dissolve it from inside. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she could not fully read yet. That is a very precise and sophisticated interpretation of binding magic from someone who says they are a territory tracker. I read a great deal, Sable said. The archive access that comes with territory work is one of the better parts of the position. He almost smiled. She noted this with the same precision with which she noted everything. What would constitute a breach of the founding agreement from the inside? She asked. The binding was framed as a protection of the territory, he said. The founders told me that was why they were sealing me, that they needed to contain my power for the safety of the land. That framing was the stated purpose of the binding. If the current leadership has been actively harming the territory rather than protecting it, the binding's own terms would begin to work against themselves. He paused. The crack you found was not new. No, she agreed. I think it's been widening for approximately 8 months. What changed 8 months ago? Sable thought about what she knew of clan politics 8 months ago. She thought about the council sessions she had peripherally heard about while making her silent rounds of the compound. She thought about the new trade agreements that had been announced with considerable ceremony and minimal detail. She thought about the change in the northern patrol routes that she had noticed in the territorial assignments, but not been offered an explanation for. There was a significant political development 8 months ago, she said slowly. The council formalized an arrangement with the Vorn interests, the Northern Territory. What interests? Extraction. There are mineral deposits in the northern sector that have been considered off-limits since the founding, because they sit directly on top of the primary ley line junction for this territory. She heard her own voice carrying the flat tone it got when she was managing the distance between knowing something and understanding all of its implications. If someone began extracting from those deposits 8 months ago, the ley line junction would be under significant pressure. Cale Dawnspire looked at her with those ancient hawk's eyes and said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of something very old and very patient, arriving at a conclusion it had hoped not to arrive at. They are doing it again, he said. Doing what? Treating the land as a resource to be consumed, rather than a system to be maintained. He looked out over the territory, and she watched his profile against the darkening sky and thought about how strange it was to be sitting on a mountain with a 300-year-old primordial discussing clan politics, as though this were a normal Tuesday. The corruption that was here when the founders first arrived, it was not random. It was the result of the same mistake, made by a different group of people, in a territory to the north. They extracted what the land held and did not account for the consequences, and the imbalance spread. He paused. The founders knew this. I told them. I showed them the records of what had happened in the north and explained in considerable detail why the ley line junction must not be disturbed. They put it in the founding law, Sable said. She had read the founding law. It was one of the documents available in the Territory Archive, old and formal and very specific about the northern sector. The prohibition is explicit. Yes, he said it simply. They used that knowledge, learned at considerable cost, codified it into law, and then their descendants are now selling access to the very thing they were warned about. And the binding that was supposed to protect the territory is dissolving, because the people who created it, to theoretically protect the land, are destroying it. He turned to look at her directly. And the person who noticed something was wrong and came to investigate is a tracker who works alone and does not appear to have anyone in the council who listens to her reports. The accuracy of that landed with a quiet impact. She did not answer it directly. I have been filing reports for 8 months, she said. I know. I can feel what has been done to the land. The records of it are in the ground itself. His expression was not unkind. You have been telling the truth about what you observed to people who had reasons not to hear it. This was the most precisely she had ever felt understood by anyone. The sensation was deeply uncomfortable, and she was not sure what to do with it, so she filed it in the category of things requiring further examination, and returned to the practical problem in front of them. The extraction needs to stop, she said. If the ley line junction fails completely, the territorial damage won't be reversible on any timeline that matters to living wolves. No, he agreed. It won't. The council won't listen to me. No, he agreed. Again, they won't. Not while the arrangement is profitable, and I am sealed on a mountain. You are no longer sealed on a mountain. He looked at her steadily. No, I am not. The wind moved between them, and Sable felt her wolf settle from its flattened terror into something that was still cautious but was no longer afraid. A recalibration that surprised her because her wolf had better instincts than her conscious mind, and usually knew things first. She considered what she was sitting with. A primordial entity who had been sealed for 300 years by the founding ancestors of her clan, who had reason to be furious beyond any scale she could easily imagine, who had the kind of power that the council's founders had considered dangerous enough to seal rather than negotiate with, who had just been released by the accidental touch of an unranked territory tracker. She also considered what she had observed in the past hour of interaction with him, the precision of his speech, the absence of performance in it, the way he had looked at the dying territory with grief rather than triumph at the chance for revenge. "What do you want?" she asked. "Not what needs to happen with the land. What do you want?" No one in 300 years, she suspected, had asked him that. The quality of his stillness changed. "I want the land to survive," he said finally. "I have always wanted that. It was not a condition of my help then, and it is not a condition of my help now." He paused. "I also want to not be sealed into a rock again. That is a reasonable secondary preference." "Yes," she said. "That seems reasonable." She offered him the rest of her dried meat, because it was the only practical thing she had to offer, and she was a practical person. He looked at the offering with an expression she couldn't fully read, and then accepted it with a gravity that made the gesture feel more significant than it had any right to be. They sat in the dark on the mountain and ate together, and below them, the gray sickness spread a little further through the land they were both, each in very different ways, determined to save. "If you are still with me right now, I need you to do one thing before we go further. Click that like button. Not for the algorithm, though the algorithm appreciates your consideration, but because you already feel something for these two, don't you? This quiet woman who has been right about everything and heard by no one, and this ancient power who has been alone, so long that being offered dried meat in the dark feels like a kindness worth noting. Leave a comment and tell me. What do you think Kale is going to do when he finally comes down from that mountain and stands in front of the council that sealed him? I want to know what you're expecting, because I promise you, it is not what you think." Part 2 to follow immediately. Part 2. Sable had climbed this mountain alone with 3 days of supplies and the intention of staying long enough to document the source of the territorial damage and return with evidence. She had not planned for the evidence to have amber eyes and a 3-century backlog of grievances. She revised her timeline accordingly. They spent the night on the summit, not from any particular plan, but because descending unfamiliar terrain in the dark was inadvisable, and because there was, Sable found, something unexpectedly natural about the continuation of their conversation once it had started. Kale asked questions about the, clan as it currently existed, not in the careful, diplomatic way of someone managing their reactions, but with the direct curiosity of someone who had been absent for a very long time and wanted to understand the shape of what had changed. She answered him the way she answered every inquiry, accurately, without editorializing, noting the specific places where she had data and the specific places where she was inferring. She told him about the current pack structure, the alpha and beta hierarchy, that had consolidated significantly over the past 2 generations, drawing more decision-making power toward the Central Council and away from the sector leads. The way the founding law had been progressively reinterpreted in council sessions over the past 50 years, with certain provisions quietly reclassified as advisory rather than binding. The reduction in the territorial stewardship protocols she had found in the historical records compared to what was currently practiced. The careful observation of forms emptied of substance. Ceremonies continued without the understanding that had made them meaningful. He listened to all of this without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, in a way that felt like digestion, rather than silence for its own sake. "They have been moving toward this for a long time," he said. "Yes, it is a slow process. Each individual decision seems defensible in isolation. That is how most catastrophes work." He looked at the stars with the ease of someone for whom the sky was a familiar, rather than a backdrop. The founders were not evil people. I want to be clear about that. They were people with power who became afraid of power they couldn't control, and they made a decision they believed was pragmatic. The evil was not in the intention. It was in the choice to treat binding as a solution to a relationship problem. Sable thought about this. She thought about her father, who had been made small by a political system that found his continued existence inconvenient, and about the way that smallness had not been cruel in any single identifiable moment, but had been the accumulated weight of 100 small deflections. The evil that was not in any one intention. What were you, to them? She asked. Before the binding, what was the arrangement? A partner, he said simply. Or so I believed. I have had 300 years to reconsider the precision of that word. He did not say it. Bitterly. He said it the way she said things that were simply true, even when they were inconvenient. I cared about this land. I helped them because the land needed help, and they were the community of living things on it. I did not think of it as a transaction. They, at some point, began to. She sat with that. The sky above them was clear and extraordinary at this altitude. The kind of sky that reminded you the world was larger than any particular piece of it. And the cold was the clean cold of high places, not the complicated cold of low ground in winter. The binding didn't work perfectly, she said. You were sealed, but the land still needed you. The territorial problems that arose in your absence weren't resolved by the absence. No, they couldn't be. The ley line network requires active tending by something capable of interfacing with it directly. The founders knew this. Their solution was to hope the network would be stable enough that the need wouldn't arise. He paused. That was optimistic. And now it's arising. Now it is arising, he agreed. And the crack in the binding was the land's own distress signal, working through the stone because the stone was the only medium available to it. Sable thought about her 8 months of reports. She thought about the council receiving those reports and filing them and continuing to approve the northern extraction, and telling themselves that the situation was being monitored. She thought about the particular species of willfulness that looked like inaction, but was in fact a very active choice to protect a profitable arrangement at the expense of everything that arrangement was supposed to serve. What needs to happen physically, she said, to address the ley line damage before it becomes permanent? He described it for her in precise terms that she followed more easily than she had expected, partly because her years in the territory had given her a practical understanding of the land as a system, and partly because he explained it with the same directness she had come to appreciate in everything he said. The extraction at the northern junction needed to stop immediately. The physical works that had been installed needed to be removed, carefully, in the reverse order of their installation. The damaged section of the ley line would need to be supported through the recovery period, which would require someone capable of channeling the kind of energy the line ran on to act as a bridge across the gap while it healed. That someone was him. The timeline, if they acted within the next month, was recovery possible. If they waited another month after that, recovery probable, but with lasting reduced capacity. If they waited through the season, the junction would fail completely, and the territory would spend the next century dealing with the consequences. 1 month, Sable said, give or take. She was already doing the calculations. The political mathematics of convincing a council that had been ignoring her reports for 8 months to immediately cease a profitable extraction agreement and remove the infrastructure they had invested in building, on the word of an unranked tracker and an entity they had successfully contained for 300 years. She had the evidence, carefully documented over 8 months. But evidence had not been sufficient before. She needed something else. The Territorial Council holds a monthly review at the new moon, she said. That is 11 days from now. 11 days. If I can present the evidence in a format that cannot be dismissed, with you present, the Council cannot simply reclassify the report as advisory. She thought about the founding law and its specific provisions. The binding that sealed you was tied to the founding agreement. If that agreement is now void because its terms have been violated, you are technically operating under the protections of the original compact, as an allied entity, not a ward of the clan. He looked at her with an expression she was learning to recognize as the one he got when she said something that surprised him into interest. You have been thinking about the legal architecture of my situation, he said. I have been thinking about leverage, she said honestly. The council responds to things that have formal standing. If you walk into that chamber as an angry primordial, they will panic and reach for whatever binding they can construct. If you walk in as the holder of rights under the founding compact that they are demonstrably in violation of, you are on different legal terrain. You are suggesting I arrive as a creditor rather than a threat. I am suggesting that the outcome we need, which is the extraction stopped and the land healed, is more achievable if the council has a formal pathway to compliance that preserves their dignity, rather than being confronted with a power they cannot match and having nothing to do with their fear except increase it. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched his profile in the dark and thought about the 300 years behind those eyes and what it must have taken to remain that precise about reality after that much isolation. You are trying to protect them from themselves, he said finally. I am trying to protect the land, she said, which means the process cannot end in a way that destabilizes the clan, because the clan is part of the land's living system. A traumatized pack does not steward territory well. He turned to look at her directly. You think about the whole system. It is what trackers do. Most trackers track prey, he said. I track patterns, she said. Prey is just one kind. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read in the dark. Then he said, I will need several days to reacquaint myself with this form. 3 centuries of containment has left certain things requiring attention. She understood this to mean that the night on the mountain was transitioning into a practical working arrangement and oriented herself accordingly. She had, she assessed, 11 days to prepare a presentation that would redirect the political will of an entrenched council that had been moving steadily toward the decision she needed to reverse, with a 300-year-old primordial as her primary witness, while continuing her regular tracking duties so as not to trigger early awareness of what she was building. She had worked with worse constraints. I will need access to the full archive, she said. The restricted sections. I can help with that, he said. How? The bindings on the archive's restricted sections were placed by the same founding council that sealed me. They are tied to the same compact. He almost smiled, which is now, as you have noted, demonstrably void. She filed this under useful, and went to sleep wrapped in her outer layer with her back against a large rock, sleeping the way trackers slept in the field, completely, and briefly and alert to any change in the quality of the silence. She woke to find that Kyle Dawnspire had been awake through the night and was watching the dawn come up over the territory with an expression that she recognized once she had looked at it for a moment, as someone relearning something they had been prevented from experiencing for a very long time. She did not interrupt it. She packed her things and ate her breakfast and waited until he was ready. They descended the mountain. Together. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications if you want to know what happens when Sable brings Kale Dawnspire down from the mountain and into the clan compound for the first time. Because I need you to understand something. The wolves of Ashvale have no idea what is about to walk through their gates. And neither, in the ways that matter most, does Kale. Not yet. The descent took most of the morning. Sable moved through the terrain with the efficiency of long practice, and Kale moved with something that was not exactly grace, but was in the vicinity of it. The way a person moves through an environment when they understand it at a level that makes technical skill beside the point. He was still recalibrating. She could see that. There were moments when he would pause and simply stand in one place with a quality of attention that had nothing to do with their immediate surroundings, as though he were listening to something at a frequency below human hearing. She did not ask him about these moments. She gave him the space she would have given any creature that needed to reorient after a long absence from its environment. At the base of the mountain, where the terrain leveled into the beginning of the forest belt that separated the high ground from the valley floor, he paused and looked at the line of dead soil she had been documenting, the gray stain spreading through the healthy ground like a slow infection. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the earth the same way she had pressed her palm against the stone, and she watched his face change. Not dramatically. A subtle shift in the set of his jaw, a compression around his eyes. How long has this been visible at ground level? He asked without looking up. 8 months at this intensity. I think the subsurface damage began earlier. Yes. He stood. The junction is under considerable stress. A month is optimistic. I had based that estimate on the surface reading available to me on the mountain. The ground-level reality is more advanced. He looked at her. We may have closer to 3 weeks. 3 weeks instead of a month. The new Moon Council session was 11 days away. That remained the fixed point. She revised her timeline for preparation accordingly and kept moving. The clan compound was a half-day's walk from the mountain base through the forest and across the valley. She had been gone overnight and would be expected back by evening. Her absence not remarked upon, but her presence at the morning tracking muster having been automatically noted as absent without comment, which was the particular administrative acknowledgement given to functions that ran themselves. She was not concerned about questions. She was, however, concerned about how to introduce Kale Dawnspire to clan territory, without triggering the instinctive defensive response of a pack encountering an unknown powerful entity on their ground. "You should stay in the outer territory tonight," she said, as they walked, "near the northern tree line. I'll bring supplies. Give the wolves and the boundary patrols time to register your scent without an immediate face-to-face confrontation." He looked at her sidelong. "You are managing my integration into the pack's awareness. I am managing a situation with multiple variables," she said. "You are one of the variables. You are a remarkable person," he said, not as a compliment, but as a statement of observed fact, which she found considerably more meaningful. "I am a competent person in a situation that requires competence," she said. "It is not the same thing. Often it is," he said. She left him at the northern tree line as the afternoon light went golden and low, with her secondary pack from the emergency cache she kept at the territorial waypoint, which contained 3 days of supplies and a detailed map of the sector drawn in her own hand, annotated with the resource points, the water sources, the places where shelter could be made. Easily, she watched him take the map and examine it with focused attention, noting the annotations with an expression that was beginning to become familiar to her as the one he got when he encountered information that was both useful and more than he had expected. "The water sources in the eastern grid are marked as unreliable," he said. "They have been affected by the territorial damage. I have flagged them in the northern patrols as potential contamination risk. Have you?" "Since month 4. She paused. "My reports on that point were also filed." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she would not fully understand until later. A quality of being seen by someone who understood exactly what it cost to keep doing precise, careful work in the absence of acknowledgement, and finding that work exactly as valuable as it had always been, regardless of whether anyone had been paying attention. "I will be here," he said. "I know," she said, and meant it in a practical sense. She knew because she had read the terrain and assessed the most defensible shelter options and determined where she would position herself in his circumstances. But she noticed, walking back through the trees toward the compound, that the knowing felt like something slightly larger than its practical content, and she filed this too in the category of things requiring further examination. The clan compound in the early evening was the particular organized busyness of a community, at the transition between work and rest, the daily reports being compiled, the kitchen fires going, the hierarchical socialization of wolves at the end of a shared day. Sable moved through it the way she always moved through it, efficiently and at the margins, present enough to access what she needed, and absent enough not to require accommodation. She went to the archive building, which was technically closed but had a lock she had been carrying a key to for 4 years, by virtue of her tracking clearance, and let herself in. The restricted archive section was behind a second door she had never been through, not because she lacked curiosity, but because the lock was a working binding seal, not a mechanical device, and she had no means of opening a working binding seal. She stood in front of it now and thought about what Kale had said about the founding compact's void. She pressed her palm against the seal, the way she pressed her palm against things she needed to understand. The binding. Symbols on the door were the same script as the ones on the mountain stone, and like those, they had a quality of dimness about them, a light that was fading. She pressed a little harder, not with physical force, but with the focused intention she brought to reading terrain. The specific quality of attention that said, "I am here to understand this, not to overcome it." The seal dissolved under her hand like morning frost. The door opened. She spent 3 hours in the restricted archive. What she found there required her to sit down twice. The first time was when she found the original founding compact in full, not the excerpted version available in the General Archive, but the complete document, which contained sections that had been explicitly omitted from the public version. The sections that described, in the careful legal language of 300 years ago, the exact circumstances under which Cale Dawnspire had been sealed, including the Council's own private assessment that he had done nothing to warrant the binding and that the action was taken preemptively out of strategic concern, rather than any genuine threat. The founders had known they were sealing an innocent ally. They had documented their reasoning, apparently because the clan's original record keepers had been rigorous people, and then they had sealed those sections away with their binding magic where no one would find them. Until now, the second time she sat down was when she found the current council's correspondence regarding the Northern extraction. Not the official records, which were minimal and vague, but the full communication thread, stored here apparently because whoever had filed it had thought the restricted archive was safe. It was meticulous evidence of exactly what she had suspected, and more than she had suspected, a deliberate and fully understood violation of the founding prohibition, agreed to by the full council in a private session with no public record, with complete awareness of the ley line risk explicitly documented in those same communications, and explicitly set aside in favor of the financial arrangement with the Vorn interests. They had known. Every senior council member had known. The report from the clan's own historical records that described exactly what uncontrolled extraction from the ley line junction would produce. The report that Sable's own reports had been functionally replicating for 8 months had been attached to the approval. Communication as an acknowledgement of risk, and then approved anyway. She copied everything. She worked with the focused precision of someone who had been waiting for this specific evidence for 8 months, without knowing that was what she was waiting for. And when she was done, she left the archive as she had found it, locked and apparently sealed, and went back to her quarters and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while, thinking about what it meant to have been right all along and to have been ignored all along, and to now hold in her hands the proof of both. Then she went to sleep, because she had work to do tomorrow, and sleep was a tool she used as efficiently as all the others. What she was building over the next 9 days was not a confrontation. She had been very clear with herself about this from the beginning. Confrontations produced defensive responses, and defensive responses produced bad decisions, and bad decisions were what had gotten them to this point. What she was building was a case, structured like the territory cases she assembled for the annual sector reviews, with primary evidence and supporting documentation, and a clear consequential logic that moved from present conditions to future outcomes via a chain of causation that could not be reasonably disputed by anyone engaging with it in good faith. The qualification about good faith was, she acknowledged, the operative variable. Cale came to the tree line each evening after the 3rd day, and she came to him, and they talked through the evenings in the shelter she had identified for him, a natural rock overhang in the northern forest that provided adequate cover and was well outside the regular patrol routes. She brought food, and he continued to refuse to appear to need it, but accepted it anyway, which she eventually understood was not politeness but a different kind of acknowledgement, the acceptance of a gesture, because the gesture was offered genuinely rather than because its practical content was necessary. On the 4th evening, he asked her why she was doing this. "Preparing the case?" she asked. "Staying," he said. "Coming back. You could have reported the seal break to the council and let them handle the discovery of my existence. It would have been safer for you." She thought about this genuinely. "I could have," she said. "But then the outcome would be determined by the council's response to discovering you, which would be fear and a search for control. The outcome I need is the extraction stopped and the land healed. That outcome requires the council to respond to a structured presentation of evidence with a clear remediation path, not to manage a crisis they didn't see coming. She paused. Also, she added, because she was an honest person and honesty required more than accuracy, I am not certain the council's handling of the situation would involve anyone considering what you want. He was quiet for a moment. And you consider what I want. I asked you what you wanted, she said. It seemed like the obvious starting point. He looked at her with those hawk's eyes and the quality in them that she had been cataloging for days now. The particular attention he gave her that was different from the attention he gave everything else. Not less precise, but differently oriented. Less like the attention of a naturalist, and more like the attention of someone encountering something genuinely new. Tell me what you want, he said. Not what the land needs. What you want. The inversion was exact, and she recognized it. She sat with it for a moment. I want the work to matter, she said finally. Not to be acknowledged necessarily, though that would be nice. I want there to be a version of this where the careful attention I have paid to this land for 8 years, the things I have noticed and documented and reported, produces a real outcome, where it wasn't just labor that someone else will take credit for or ignore, where it counts. She paused. I am aware that wanting is not a plan. No, he said. But it is a reason, which is more load-bearing than it appears. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The fire she had built was small and practical, and between them, and the forest around them was making its night sounds. And somewhere in the middle distance she could hear the territorial damage, as a kind of silence where there should have been sound. The absence of the small water-related noises that should have been present in this sector, and were not. How did you bear it? She asked. 300 years. He was quiet for a long moment. Poorly, he said finally, with an honesty that cost him something to produce. In the early years, not well at all. The binding was not peaceful containment. It was a specific kind of silence that was designed to hold power, which meant it was designed to hold everything that constituted being myself. I was present. I was aware. I could feel the land through the stone. I felt the lay. Line struggles over the decades. I felt the territory shift and change above me. I could do nothing. He paused. At some point I made a decision that was not exactly acceptance, but was its practical equivalent, that the being furious was consuming the only resource I had, which was my own coherence. So I stopped being furious about the binding, and started being interested in the land instead, because the land was accessible to me even through the stone, and the land was always doing something worth paying attention to. Sable thought about this for a long time. She thought about the 8 years of tracking work in a clan that didn't look at her reports. She thought about the specific decision she had made somewhere around year 3, to stop resenting the invisibility and start using it. Because the invisibility gave her access to parts of the territory and the archive that more visible people were managed away from. She thought about how a limitation you stopped fighting could become a perspective. We made similar choices, she said. Yes, he said. I noticed. The fire burned down, and they sat in the companionable silence of 2 people who had, independently and under very different conditions, arrived at the same coping strategy for being underestimated by the world and found in the recognition something they had not been looking for and were not quite sure what to do with. If you are still watching and you are not yet subscribed, I am going to need you to understand that what I just described is the most important moment in this entire story, even though nothing dramatic happened in it. Because most love stories put the drama first. They put you through the crisis and let the tenderness be the reward. But the real thing, the actual thing, starts in the small recognitions. In the 2 people finding out they made the same choice alone and discovering they didn't have to be alone in having made it. Subscribe and stay with me. The council session is in 2 days. And everything is about to change. The morning of the council session, Sable arrived at the compound's assembly hall 1 hour before the scheduled start time and arranged her evidence on the presentation table with the precise organization she brought to her territory reports. Primary evidence first, supporting documentation in order of relevance, consequential projections clearly labeled as projections, remediation pathway presented as a sequence with specific action items, timeline, and responsible parties. Kale. She had arranged to enter the hall through the secondary door at the moment she called for him, not dramatically but as a matter of logistics. because she had assessed that having him present from the start would immediately make the meeting about him, rather than about the evidence. And she needed the evidence to be heard first. She had told exactly 2 people what was going to happen. The first was Councillor Perrin, the oldest serving member of the council, who had been a junior archivist during the period of the Northern Extraction's initial approval, and who had filed a formal objection at the time that had been overruled and buried in the same restricted archive where Sable had found the other documents. Perrin had read the copy Sable brought her with hands that were very still and very deliberate, and then looked up with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. The second was Brix, the head of the Western Sector Patrol, and technically Sable's supervisor in the chain of command, though their relationship had always been more accurately described as Brix signing whatever Sable put in front of him, because he trusted her assessments and found the territory work genuinely complicated. Brix was not political. He was a practical wolf who cared about the land and his sector, and had been growing visibly worried about the territorial changes for months. He had read the evidence with a tracker's eyes and said simply, "What do you need from me?" She had told him. The council assembled at the appointed time. 7 members, including Alpha Corvin at the head of the table, a heavy wolf in his late 50s, with the particular confidence of someone who had not been meaningfully challenged in a long time. He looked at Sable's presentation setup with the mild attention he gave to all tracking reports, the attention that communicated polite acknowledgement of a function rather than genuine interest in its content. Sable stood at the presentation table and began to speak. She gave them the data first. 8 months of precise territorial documentation, presented without editorializing, with dates and measurements and the specific methodology she had used to rule out alternative explanations. She showed them the pattern of the dying territory as it looked from the mountain, the perfect expanding radius, and she showed them the ground-level correlates she had mapped, and she showed them the analysis of the Northern Extraction site, coordinates against the ley line junction maps from the founding records, which she had brought from the General Archive in the public access section that any council member could have retrieved at any time. She watched their faces. 2 of the 7 were paying genuine attention. The rest were wearing the expression of people who were managing the length of something they had already decided about. She put the founding compact on the table, the full version, with the omitted sections, printed in clear copies. The quality of the silence in the room changed. "The restricted archive materials are not accessible to tracking staff," said Councillor Vile, who was also the council member whose signature appeared most frequently in the Northern Extraction correspondence. "The restricted archive binding dissolved 8 days ago," Sable said, "when the founding compact terms were rendered void by the council's documented violation of the founding prohibition regarding the northern sector. I have a detailed account of the legal architecture of this if the council would like to examine it." She placed the legal analysis on the table. She had written it over 4 nights with the help of a 300-year-old primordial who understood the founding compact's original intent better than anyone alive. Alpha Corvin's hands were flat on the table. "Where did you obtain these materials?" "From the restricted archive," she said, "which was accessible to me as I described." "This is a serious accusation," he said. "These are serious documents," she agreed. "They represent the Council's own recorded deliberations regarding actions that are currently causing measurable terminal damage to this territory's foundational systems. I am not making an accusation. I am presenting the Council with its own records and asking for an emergency remediation plan to be approved today, given the timeline I have documented. On whose authority are you making this demand?" Councillor Vile said, and his voice had the particular edge of someone who was used to that question-ending conversations. "On the authority of the founding compact," said a voice from the secondary door, and the council turned, and Cale Dawnspire walked into the assembly hall for the first time in 300 years. He was not performing anything. He did not need to. He simply walked in and stood at the far end of the table from Alpha Corvan and occupied the space, with a quality of presence that made the room feel different. Not smaller, but more precisely aware of itself, the way a room felt when something entered it that the room had not been built to contain. The founding compact includes provisions for the participation of allied entities in territorial governance decisions affecting the land they are bound to protect, he said. I am the allied entity named in that compact. My binding has been dissolved by the compact's own terms on the authority of the violations your council has committed against the agreement your ancestors made with me. He looked at Corvin directly. I am not here to threaten this pack. I am here because the tracker who has been trying to tell you about the damage for 8 months asked me to be. And because the land is dying, and I am the one who can help it heal, if your council makes the decision today to allow that help. The silence was very different from the silence at the beginning of the meeting. Counselor, Perrin placed her own document on the table. Her original objection from 20 years ago, the formal dissent that had been overruled and buried. Brix, from his position at the perimeter of the room, said, I can provide direct testimony to the territorial conditions in the western sector, which I have been reporting on for 6 months without adequate council response. I am formally requesting that testimony be entered into the record today. 300 years of sealed primordial. 8 months. Of ignored reports. 1 formal objection buried for 2 decades. The council looked at all of it spread across their table and did what cornered institutions do when the documentation is undeniable. They looked for an exit that preserved their dignity. Alpha Corvin looked at Sable. There was something in his expression that she recognized as the specific quality of someone encountering for the first time a person they had been overlooking, and being confronted with the distance between who they assumed that person was and who that person actually turned out to be. What, he said slowly, is the remediation pathway? Sable put the final document on the table. Immediate cessation of extraction activity. Removal of installed infrastructure beginning with the most recent additions, in reverse order. Formal restitution to the ley line junction under Cale Dawnspire's guidance over a period of 4 to 6 weeks. Structural reform of the Territorial Council to include independent, stewardship oversight that cannot be overruled by financial considerations. She paused. And a formal review of the archive sealing practices, because there are a number of things in there that the pack as a whole has a right to know. It was not a fast process. That should be said clearly. Corvin did not simply agree, and the meeting did not end in 20 minutes of institutional transformation. What happened was what happened in real councils when the evidence was undeniable and the exit was available. A long and painful series of procedural maneuvers, as various council members worked through their responses to being publicly confronted with documented decisions they had made, ranging from Viel's initial aggressive insistence that the restricted documents were illegally obtained, which Perrin systematically dismantled on procedural grounds, to the quieter and more genuine distress of 2 council members who had been junior signatories to the extraction approval and who appeared, on actual examination of the full evidence, to have not understood the full implications of what they were approving at the time. Sable answered every question with the same precision she brought to everything. When Viel accused her of overstepping her authority as a tracking staff member, she cited the founding compact provision for territory stewards acting in the interest of land integrity. When Corvin questioned the validity of the restricted archive access, Perrin produced the original binding, documentation that made the legal argument on its own merits. When 2 council members simultaneously tried to suggest that the remediation could be implemented in phases that would allow the extraction to continue in reduced form while the recovery was assessed, Kyle provided a technical explanation of ley line failure mechanics that made the phased approach's inadequacy clear in terms that were not debatable because they were simply physical facts. By the end of the 3rd hour, the emergency remediation plan had been approved. All 7 council members signed it. Viel's signature was last, and had the quality of something done under the specific kind of pressure that was not coercion, but simply the recognition that there was no defensible alternative. It was not gracious. It was not the result of anyone's better nature asserting itself in a moment of moral clarity. It was the outcome of meticulous preparation and undeniable documentation, and the presence in the room of a primordial entity who had 3 centuries of patience and was clearly prepared to be precise about this for as long as it took. It was enough. It was exactly enough. Sable had learned a long time ago that enough was all you needed it to be. The extraction infrastructure came down in the 10 days following the council session. Kyle managed the ley line work with a focus and a competence that caused even the most skeptical pack members to find reasons to walk past the northern sector and watch, because there was something in the way he worked with the land that was different from anything they had seen. Not dramatic, but deeply precise. The way the land itself moved slightly differently around him, as though recognizing something it had been missing. Sable filed her reports as she always had. They were read now by Perren's new oversight committee, with attention and specific responses. This was different, in ways she had not fully anticipated. She had managed without it for 8 years and had arranged herself around the absence. Having the reports acknowledged, having the recommendations acted upon, required a certain reorganization of how she understood her own work, a recalibration she made carefully and with interest rather than resistance. Kyle found her at the end of the second week of the remediation work, in the eastern sector where she was documenting the first signs of soil recovery, the very early stages of green returning to gray ground, small and cautious and real. She was crouched over a patch of reviving moss with her field notebook and her characteristic focused attention, and she heard him come up behind her with the particular quality of his movement that she had learned to distinguish from wind and from the sounds of actual wildlife, something between the two, and not quite either. The eastern tributary is showing restored flow, he said. She looked up. I know. I measured it this morning. It is at 30% of baseline, which is within range for this point in the recovery arc. You had projected 32%. The projection had a margin of error. He crouched beside her and looked at the moss and said nothing for a moment, in the way she had come to understand, as him being present with something rather than preparing to speak about it. She went back to her notebook. You are cataloging the recovery the way you catalog the damage, he said after a while. Yes, it is a different kind of work. She thought about this. It is the same methodology, she said. The direction of the change is what is different. He was quiet. Then, how does it feel? The different direction. She sat back on her heels and looked at the greening ground and thought about the 8 months of watching things die and the particular quality of the last 2 weeks watching things come back, and gave him the honest answer. Like it was worth it, she said. The whole thing. The 8 years and the ignored reports and the climbing the mountain. Alone. All of it. Like it was building toward something that mattered. She paused. I am aware that is a very tidy way to feel about it. It is not tidy, he said. It is true. Tidy and true are not the same. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the hawk's precision he brought to everything, but the quality underneath it had shifted over these 2 weeks into something she had been carefully not naming, because she was a precise person, and she did not want to name things imprecisely. What will you do? She asked. After the remediation is complete. He held her gaze. That depends on what is here to stay for. She felt her wolf shift in her chest, not the terrified flattening of the first meeting, but something that was the opposite of that. An orientation, a turning toward. The land will need ongoing tending, she said. The oversight committee is functional, but they will need someone who understands the ley line network to consult on long-term stewardship protocols. That is a professional argument for my continued presence, he said. Yes. Is there a personal one? She thought about the fire on the mountain, the evenings at the tree line, the moment she had said, I want the work to matter, and he had said that is a reason, which is more load-bearing than it appears. She thought about 2 people who had each made the same choice alone, and what it might mean to not have to make the next choice alone. I asked you what you wanted, she said. On the mountain. No one had asked you that. No. What do you want now? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the directness that she had come to find the most reliable thing about him, I want to stay. Not because the land needs me, though it does. Not because the compact gives me rights here, though it does. Because there is a person here who noticed things no one else noticed, and cared about things no one else cared about, and asked what I wanted before she asked what I could do for her. And I Find that I am not interested in going somewhere she is not. The moss was greening under their feet. The tributary was running 30% of baseline and climbing. Somewhere in the northern sector, the ley line junction was knitting itself back together with the patience of systems that had existed for longer than anyone's memory, and intended to go on existing. She reached out and pressed her palm to the ground the way she always did, reading what the land had to tell her. Then she turned her hand over, and he took it. And that was also a kind of reading. Two people who had spent a long time making themselves accurately understood to a world that wasn't particularly listening, discovering the specific relief of being understood by someone who was. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He held her hand in the greening field, and the land went on recovering under both their palms, and that was enough. And more than enough, and exactly what it was. Leave a comment right now. I need you to tell me, did you feel that? That ending. Because I am not done yet. Stay for the epilogue. Please. Epilogue. 7 years later. The archive was public now. That had been one of the first formal outcomes of the structural reform, and it had taken 3 years of committee work and historical review, and a number of very difficult conversations between the PAC's current leadership and its membership, because the full founding records contained things that required being honestly reckoned with. The council that had sealed Kyle Dawnspire had written down their reasons. The community had to read those reasons and sit with what it meant that their founders had made that choice and then sealed that choice away from examination. It was not a comfortable process. It produced 2 years of complicated communal discourse that Sable had observed with the focused attention she brought to everything, and had contributed to through the Territorial Stewardship Committee, rather than through public speech. Because the work of honest institutional reckoning required the community to do it for themselves, and not to have it done to them. The outcome was a governing structure that Perrin had spent 4 years designing, and the PAC had spent 1 year debating and had finally ratified in a full assembly that was itself one of the first full assemblies in 60 years, because the previous council had gradually moved most decisions into closed sessions. Alpha Corvin had retired at the end of Aoi. The first year, not forced out but recognizing, in what Sable assessed as the most functional thing he had done in years, that his continued presence in the role was an impediment to the reform process. His successor, elected by the full PAC in the first open alpha selection in 3 generations, was a practical and thoughtful wolf named Sarah, who had been a sector lead in the Southern Territory and who had been reading Sable's reports, she revealed at her election, since her first week in the Baum role. Sable was head of territorial stewardship now, a position that had been created specifically because it had not existed and it should have. A formal role with direct council standing, and the authority to trigger automatic review processes when territorial data reached specific thresholds. She had written the position's operational charter herself, and it had been adopted almost unchanged, because the Oversight Committee had read 8 years of her reports by then, and understood what she was seeing and why the formal standing mattered. Weil had resigned from the council in year 2, before the full findings of the internal review were published. His resignation had been accepted without ceremony. The northern extraction infrastructure had been fully removed by the end of the first year. The ley line junction had reached full recovery capacity in year 3, which was 4 months ahead of Kale's projections, a fact he had noted with the satisfaction of someone who appreciated when the land exceeded expectations. The rivers ran clear and full through all 4 sectors. The territorial damage was gone. The gray discoloration in the soil had faded and then disappeared, and the land that had been dying had gone on insisting on being alive with the stubborn persistence of systems that had longer memories than any of the things living on them. Sable was standing in the archive on a late autumn afternoon, doing the annual review of the founding records that was now a formal part of the stewardship calendar, when she heard the specific quality of step she had learned to know without turning. She did not turn. She kept reading. "The eastern tributary measurement from this morning," Kyle said. 98% of historical baseline, she said. "I know. I was there. You were up before dawn. The measurement window for the best reading is the hour before sunrise. I am aware. I was also up before dawn." She turned then, because his tone had the particular quality It got when he was making a point by adjacent approach rather than directly, which she had learned over 7 years was one of the very few times he was indirect and was always worth paying attention to. He was standing in the archive doorway with the autumn light behind him and 7 years of being present in this place, visible on him in the way that presence accumulated, not dramatically, but in the quality of ease. A primordial who had learned to be at home again and chosen to stay. He was, holding 2 cups of tea, which was a gesture she had come to understand over the years as his version of the dried meat she had offered him on the mountain. A practical offering, as a vehicle for something that was not primarily practical. She closed the founding record and took her cup. "The pack's autumn gathering is tonight," he said. "I know. You are going. I am expected to present the annual stewardship summary. After the presentation." She looked at him. He looked back. "After the presentation," she said, "I am going to stand in the hall with everyone else and eat the harvest food and watch the pack that my father spent his life in exile from celebrate itself, and know that the thing I spent 8 years trying to protect is intact and recovering." She paused. "And then I am going to go home." "Home," he said, and the word in his voice was not a question, but a recognition. The specific quality of a word that had changed its meaning over time and was now entirely different from what it had been. She had given him a key to the house 3 years ago. Not ceremonially. She had simply left it on the table and said the lock had been sticking, and she thought the issue was with the mechanism, and she needed a second opinion. And he had understood this precisely, and had not made it more than it was, which was also exactly what it was. "Home," she confirmed. He nodded. He drank his tea. Outside the archive window, the territory spread in its autumn colors, the forests full, and the rivers running, and the sky above the gray mountain clear of everything except weather. The ordinary weather of a healthy place, doing what healthy places did. Somewhere in the founding records on the shelf behind her was the document that had sealed him. It was not sealed anymore. Neither was anything else about the history of this place, or about the 2 people who had changed it, or about the stubborn, precise, unhurried work of caring about something and refusing to stop caring about it until the caring produced what it was always capable of producing. The land breathed in and out, and they drank their tea in the autumn light, and that was entirely enough, and had always been going to be. Thank you for staying all the way through this story. If this found you at a moment when you needed to hear that your careful work matters, even when no one seems to be paying attention, then this one was for you. Leave a comment with the word Falcon if you made it to the end. Subscribe if you want more stories about the quiet ones who hold things together. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that being seen by the right person is worth every year of being overlooked by the wrong ones. I will see you in the next story.